Welcome, everybody, to this episode of All the Good Men. Today, I have Ismail Ali joining me. I am so stoked for this conversation. Friends might know Ismail as Izzy. I know him as Izzy and Ismail. There's like these slightly different personas.
Multitudes.
It's so good to have you here. Thank you for being down to have this conversation.
Yeah, Fabi, thank you so much for the invitation. I was just saying before we started recording that I'm really grateful to have been invited, and I really appreciate like what you're trying to do with this podcast, with this conversation of just being like, let's get a little bit deeper than just the slides on the internet of how we navigate this like these big conversations
Yeah.
around gender and identity and interpersonal relationships and internal, landscapes. So I'm excited to be in this conversation and excited to be here with you.
Yay, it's so good to see you. So good to chat about the deeper layers of what we've known each other for some time, and we've kind of like
hmm
observed what each other does and respected what each other does for a while, but it's sweet to be able to deepen in and see where our work also collides and intermingles.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's do it.
Amazing. So, a little intro to Ismail. So, Ismail has been personally utilizing psychedelics and other substances in, and I love this part, celebratory and spiritual contexts for over half of his life. And he's been actively participating in a really powerful, beautiful way in the drug policy reform movement for a decade. He is the director of policy and advocacy at MAPS, which is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. And Ismail supports the design, the building, and the implementation of psychedelic policy reforms across the country, across the world. And he also co founded and co chairs the board of the Psychedelic Bar Association. He's also licensed to practice law in the state of California and advises, and also is formally affiliated with and has served as leadership for a bunch of organizations in the drug policy ecosystem. So, Students for Sensible Drug Policy, Chacruna Institute, the Ayahuasca Defense Fund, the Alchemy Community Therapy Center. What you're doing is absolutely incredible. It is so deeply important, so needed, and it's so needed to be done in a way of integrity and in a way of understanding the vastness of law, of medical safety, of the absolute magic and potency and importance of psychedelics and plant medicines. I am so grateful to you for what you do and for just doing it in such a badass way. I remember the first time that I think it was the first time we met each other, and it was at a Burning Man event, and we were
hmm
on a some kind of bus, and Danny G, bless his soul, played like a 6 to 8 hour set of just like the best
Yeah.
fucking music, and we were getting down for hours and hours and hours. And I remember, I think we met earlier in that day, and I looked at you, and I was like, you had on this like cowboy hat and all these cool glimmering things, and
Dangly
yeah,
things.
and I looked at you, and I just said, "You are so cool." And I remember you said, I don't think I've ever heard someone say that and mean it so much.
I was so honored in that moment. I was like, wow, you really see me right now. Like it was probably like, I don't know, like 7:45 in the
Yeah.
morning or something. We'd been up all night. It was like a whole thing.
Oh my gosh. So, and that was actually before I knew all the badassery that you do in the world. So, just from your outfit and your way of dancing and your dangly things and your cowboy hat, I was like, this person is fucking cool. And then to understand what it is that you're doing in the world, I'm just in so much awe and admiration and respect for what you do.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I feel very seen now and in that time and in this conversation. And part of the reason I'm really glad to have this conversation here with you is because a lot of the conversations I've had about that work, about policy reform, about legal change, about like the really technical regulatory structural stuff that has to happen so we can be in a more just world, is all very interesting and very important. And I feel grateful to be in the mix. And I think that there are often very large cultural elements that are overlooked because
Mm.
people are so obsessed with like the science or the policy, which again, good reasons for that. But one of the reasons I'm excited about being in this conversation with you is because I think that some of these other big cultural elements that psychedelics and plant medicines and these other substances have impacted us through is not just in the realm of policy and science. It's also in spirituality, it's also in gender, it's also in our social roles, it's also in how we navigate our relationships. So it feels like what we're, starting the conversation here today is really just among us, is really just like acknowledging that there's this whole other layer of like things, a phenomenology of experience that people are going through with these substances, that isn't just about like the stuff that's in the newspapers right now. Like I think a lot of people experience very big transformations with respect to their experience of gender or their experience of relationality or their experience of their identity with psychedelics and other substances. And that's like people know it, but it's like that's not the thing that's like necessarily so visible right now because we're, I mean, for good reason, really focused on mental health and these other things that feel really like desperate and urgent. So it's like, yes, we have to focus on those things because there's desperation, like people are suffering a lot. And like the aperture is much bigger.
Mm.
It's not, it's like there is a lot to focus on. So yeah,
Yeah.
glad to be in that mix here.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like the recognizing also the importance and the vastness of the cultural implications of what psychedelics and plant medicines mean for our society as
Hmm.
smaller societies and then also within the world society, the global
Hmm.
society.
Totally.
Yeah. I'm curious how, you've chosen to dedicate your life to psychedelic policy reform and and like I shared in your bio there, for over half your life, you've been utilizing psychedelics both in a celebratory
Hmm.
way and in a spiritual way, and I'm sure oftentimes both. And I'm curious to hear about some of the ways that your relationship to psychedelics, your understanding of psychedelics, your immersion in the realms of psychedelics has shaped the human that you've become in regards to that might be in regards to culture, in regards to gender. How has it, and I'm sure there are so many different ways, but what are a couple of ways that you feel like are the most powerful, obvious, impactful ways that it has shifted you?
Yeah. No, I appreciate this question. And you're right, there's a million answers, but I can probably think of a couple specific like ideas to jump in on. So first, just speaking to the origin of the question, like the starting point there, I appreciate that you appreciated the language, spiritual or celebratory. And part of the reason I landed there, just as a starting point, is that a lot of conversations about psychedelics, but I would say drugs in general, non-ordinary state substances, really kind of reduces them into two areas, or maybe three. Is it like medical? Is it therapeutic and good for you, according to some paradigm of like what health is? Is it spiritual, which is for some reason sometimes separated from medical? Like, is it about this kind of esoteric spiritual thing? Like, is it religion or prayer or something like that? Or is it recreational? And recreational is like the scary, dirty word in the corner. Like, are you having fun? You better stop. So I say I like to use more creative terms there because first off, I don't think recreation is a dirty word. But like I also recognize that it's not always as precise as people want it to be. So I say like spiritual or celebratory because I was thinking about like, well, what does it mean for me to be in like a recreational drug use context, which again is like the scare quote version to describe like me being a teenager experimenting with stuff, like a bunch of the other people I grew up with, like a bunch of the people that I know, maybe a bunch of people that you know. So the kind of goal with that was to really say like, well, what's the purpose of what we're doing? And I think something like social purposes is just as valuable. A lot of us engage with substances because it helps us connect with other people. And maybe like in connecting with other people, we get to know ourselves better. And that's not just about drugs. Like a lot of practices have that element where like in relation, we like get to witness ourselves in more completion. So I appreciate that. And just as a segue to the answer to your question, like how have they impacted it? Getting more specific about like my own experiences, the like why I was seeking out altered states as a young person, as a teenager, why I decided to shift from something that if described in a novel, might be seen as more like hedonistic to something that feels more spiritual. What does that even mean? So like I say this because like better understanding my own motivations over time, reflective. It's not always in the moment I know what's going on, but like over time, better understanding my motivations and my own orientation toward this stuff has helped me understand who I am and exactly what is going on. And then maybe the next layer there is, as I think happens to most people who engage with these non-ordinary states, especially in groups or in community over time, is that eventually it stops being really about you at all.
Mm.
And it's not really like, yes, like I'm the container that's having this experience, and I'm the person through whom this particular lens of consciousness is being articulated in reality through my body, through my identity, through the momentum of my ancestry. Like there's all these pieces there. But it's also not like, it's also like easier and easier to kind of, in a transpersonal sense, like transcend or go beyond like just your own singular identity. So that was a little bit heady, but to get specific, like one of the many ways I think that those experiences have informed my own relationship to identity or culture. Maybe I'll start with speaking a little bit about gender. And also, I guess, in some ways, like the topic of this podcast, or one of them, masculinity. I was raised, socialized as male, identify that way, continue to identify that way, among other things. I like to call myself gender relaxed. That's the term I found that has really worked for me. Um, and part of, that has, like, that's not just psychedelics. That's also like my own relationship to, some of the topics I know you engage with a lot, which is like how men experience a socialization of their own masculinity,
Right.
from society, whether it's from their father or their parents or their family unit or the TV, or like nowadays Instagram and the internet. Like, so part of that sorting through like what's real in general, like what the hell is going on out there, and then also what's real for me is like for many people, a constantly reflective and refining process. And I think the role of psychedelics and other substances has been kind of twofold. One, in the way that psychedelics kind of, they like increase the permeability of our consciousness. They give us more points of entry and exit for things. It's like it allows for more movement. There's a lot of ways you can describe tools for meaning making. They kind of allow us to like do things in some way. But like part of that for me is like permeability, which is like this kind of embodied felt sense that like the thing that I experience most of the time, which is like me as like a solid person with like a boundary of physical skin and stuff, maybe isn't as solid as I
Mm.
think as I am. And that's not unique to psychedelics. Many spiritual traditions have like some version of like self, kind of exposure there, where it's like you're not exactly who you think you are, but you're also more. So that's been part of it, which is like this permeability to like, wait, maybe I'm not this thing that I was socialized that I thought I was supposed to be. And that was very liberating from a very young age. And then two, like, not only am I not necessarily thinking, but the things that I was socialized to believe are the options are not even close to the only options. So like, even if I was just one of these things or something else, even if I did have to choose an identity, I don't have to choose that based on like what I think the pressure of the external thing is, because the truth is inside of me all along, like whatever that kind of like final point is. So those are two ways where I think it's really shaped my identity and like my behavior, and like, oh, me acting as a man or acting as a gender fluid person or doing this, that, presenting in this, that, or way, like is actually something that I get to define and decide, that isn't only about like what's out there.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And isn't about you proving anything other than I'm exploring what it means to be me. I'm exploring what it means to be in this body, but then also beyond this body. And psychedelics do have a way of opening up our perception of what we thought to be true. Yes, in terms of like facts of life, but also in terms of like literally physics, where you're like, wait a second, not
Literally
how I thought
physics. No,
that
really,
worked.
really. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I don't know how esoteric you like to get in this podcast, but like there's like the phenomenology and the scientific stuff. Like you can explain like, well, psychedelics make you kind of, socially permeable because of the effects on the brain and the body, which I think is true.
Right.
And then you can get really esoteric where it's like, I mean, there's only one of us here, like even though you and I are, probably some a couple hundred miles apart, we're on the internet right now, like in our own offices or wherever. Like, so there's a spectrum of how woo and esoteric we can get
Right.
there, but either way, like to your point, like we have agency,
Yeah.
and that just feels like a key thing. Like we have a lot more agency than I think we're socialized to,
Yeah.
to believe.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I think that's part of what is so powerful about psychedelics and so scary about psychedelics
Yeah,
I would say like general society and people within traditional power structures. Traditional meaning traditional from the past few hundred or
sure,
thousand
yeah,
years. um,
yeah,
and w- what psychedelics do, or have the capacity to do, I would say, is remind us of or point us towards a deeper truth beyond structures that we've been conditioned around, which then just makes us question things a little bit, which tends to be pretty dangerous for social structures. And it,
Definitely.
it it can be, again, can be so deeply liberating, just the pure simplicity of, wait a second, I can look at this from a few different angles. I can look at this and feel into this and find my truth within this. And my synapses are firing in ways that allow me to sort of shift perspective in a way that probably hasn't done within my own lineage for hundreds or thousands of years.
Some
Yeah.
time for sure. And can I riff on
Yeah,
that?
please.
So what you're saying reminds me of a conversation that I had this week with somebody about risk, and you said it at the very beginning, about this, like there's this sort of concept of safety, and maybe just to tease it out a bit more, I think that one interpretation for why some people and why society as a whole, and maybe traditional values in the way that you were describing it, contemporary traditional values, um, follow a certain path is partially, I mean, there's a lot of reasons, including like the oppressive weight of patriarchy and like the things of the capitalism. And like, there's like real, like structural stuff that like kind of incentivize that. But also, deeper than those like kind of incentives that exist at like a structural survival level, there's also this concept of safety at the bottom of a lot of it, which is that the way you achieve safety is through this thing. And you see like very extreme examples of that where like safety means like militarism, or safety means money, or safety means whatever. So like in many ways, so many of these things to me like boil down to this like very fundamental legitimate human need for safety, and then like a misunderstanding of like what safety is, because you're getting all these advertisements that like safety means you have these new pants, like safety means you get the cool new gadget, and I'm like, whoa, like maybe if I have the cool new gadget, like I'll be safe because people will like me because I'll have the things I need. So there's this like very real distortion that we're constantly dealing with about that. And so I bring that up to say that that choice to leave safety is very
Yeah.
scary. It actually takes risk. And I think that, you sort of said this, but I think that part of the role of psychedelics or these sacred medicines or even drugs, like I like to describe them as a spectrum because they're different things to different people, is that they can sometimes fortify you to like take the risk that you need. Sometimes they trick you into taking the
Mhm.
risk, and then you're like, oh shit, I've already taken the risk. Now I got to grow. So it's sort of this idea where like there's no growth without risk. There's no risk without acknowledging that like safety is not, maybe not fully possible. Maybe it's like this construction, there's like maybe not safe but safer, this kind of idea you see in safer sex or safer in the harm reduction, you see it too, where it's like there's no safe, there's just safer.
Right.
And I'm like, well, it's like in that sense that you have to accept that there's a certain level of risk of stepping out of your
Right.
identity box.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But do you want to grow or
Yeah.
not?
Absolutely. I was talking to a friend this morning actually about the feeling that comes in the days before going to a ceremony, when you know you're about to go through the ringer of self-transformation and growth, and everything is about to be revealed, and all of this, like, you know what's coming, and it's so worth it, but it's it can be deeply scary to know, to willingly go into a depth of transformation. And oftentimes I find with plant medicines, depending on the dosage, plant medicines and psychedelics, depending on the dosage, sometimes is like very rapid, which sometimes is actually too rapid for our own comfort and safe, quote unquote, safety.
Yeah,
But it
for sure
Yeah.
comfort. Sometimes it's definitely passive for your
Yeah,
comfort, that for sure.
absolutely, absolutely. But there's this beauty in the choice around that, of this is stepping outside of my comfort zone. This is
Hmm.
worth it, even though there are moments of discomfort. But I was having a conversation with my dad about just things that we had in common, and he was like, "You're real," or different qualities that people in our family has, and he's like, "You're really comfortable with discomfort." And I was kind of like, "Huh, I haven't thought of myself as that being one of my defining features." And then he was like, "You go into the jungle and you sit on a dirt floor, and you basically sign up for having a really intense, potentially even quite negative feeling trip for like 8 hours? Like, you're
Like
pretty
a
good at
whole
being
night.
uncomfortable." It's like, "Huh, that's true." That's a good point.
I think this is the first time I've ever said this on like a podcast or anything. I've been saying this to like friends lately, but I think that sometimes I wonder if the entire point of the spiritual path, or whatever that is, whatever you call it, is just to increase your capacity for discomfort.
Mm.
Sometimes I'm like in the thing and I'm just like, why did I make this choice again? But for what it's worth, I agree with you on the nervousness. That fear is real. And like as my bio very boldly and sort of proudly, maybe, annoyingly proudly suggests, like I have been working in relationship to these substances for a long time, and especially in the context that you're talking about for over 10 years. And I get nervous every single time to this day. It's like, not that I don't, it's like there's a familiarity, but like there's a certain level where if you're aware, it's like exactly what you're saying. If you're aware that you are, or even if you're tricking yourself into doing it, like putting yourself into an uncomfortable position.
Yeah.
Why? It's because life is hard and you're going to be uncomfortable whether you like it or not. So either you get some agency or you don't. Either you're a victim to the circumstances of discomfort that is imposed upon you, and sometimes that's a legitimate angle. That's also true sometimes. And or like, when can you utilize your agency? And like that's where a lot of this comes from, like whether it's about identity, like who am I, how do I show up to other people, versus anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, and it feels like such a potent place to practice being with ourselves. There are a million ways to do that, but it's just one way, and we've seen the massive medical and psychological benefits of psychedelics and plant medicines. It's one potential place for us to really lean into understanding how to, like you said, deal with discomfort, deal with the intensity of life, and it can often feel like it's condensing a whole lifetime's worth of challenging things into this one moment where we get to choose how to engage with it in a way that is so tangible and that can then
Hmm.
impact how we engage with all of life in such a real way.
Totally. Yeah. And I think that I like that last piece. I want to make sure we get to your other questions because I know we've just been riffing for a bit, but I like that last piece because it does kind of these are not siloed concepts, like my relationship to my gender identity, or like how we show up in relation to each other, whether it's in intimate relationship or friendship or family dynamics or even just in community. Like you and I, like we know this. I'm sure most of the people listening know this too. Like those aren't like there is this attempt, and there's certain ways where you can focus on a certain element of it, and like everything is connected, man. Um,
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, a question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on. So, within the psychedelic and plant medicine world, you hear a lot of people talking about different plants specifically being gendered, being
oh,
masculine
love this
or
conversation. Yeah,
feminine. This
yes.
is one of my favorite topics. I'm like,
Hmm.
oh,
Hmm.
it's so rich with energetic wisdom and opinions and
Hmm.
personal experiences. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on sort of the genderizing of those, and I will say specifically plant medicines,
Yeah.
what your experience has been with that, and I would love to, yeah, share our new thoughts
Oh,
on that.
so good. I'm so excited to talk about this. Yeah, this is a very interesting thing, and I'm sure most of your audience knows this, but just to like set the stage, like it's not uncommon for people to, as you say, like kind of genderize or impose a gender identity, you could say, on plants or plant spirits. And in some ways, it's not quite the same, but it kind of reminds me of how some religions default to certain pronouns or certain frameworks for like their deity,
Mhm.
like this, like God is a he, or like this is identified, like so where we bring in like these human gender identity or sexual identity elements into these beings that are like the whole point of them is that they're beyond human. So it's like it's sometimes it feels like it's not quite anthropomorphizing. It's also that, but it's sort of this element of being like, where is the relatability between us and these things? And it's not. It's also sort of literal. Like I'm not a botanist by any means, but like plants do like have gender in a sense. It's or have like sexual
Yeah.
directionality. I'm sure that someone could describe that much better than I could. But so it's not like it's a completely false concept that like we're just totally inventing. It's like there is a certain level where you could say, okay, from like a purely like sexual reproductive framework, there's that aspect of it. But what you're describing is not
Mm.
that, right? What you're describing is sort of this like kind of sort of spiritual
Yeah,
association.
the energetics behind the plant, I would say.
Yeah, and I'll speak about this maybe a little bit more generally and then from my own
Perfect.
experience and perspective. So first, it's very common for people to, especially that are coming from the West or the global North, who are interested in plant medicines and the cultures that have utilized them or stewarded them for often a very long time. It's different in different places. There's sort of, I just want to make a note here that there's sometimes this sort of like flattening or romanticizing of like the past and like what the people did. And like, I like to bring these conversations, especially about traditional or indigenous practice, really into the present because we're not talking about like some like imagined past. Like it's also that, it's also the past, but it's also the present. And like, it's actually an ongoing active
Yes.
dialogue. It's not like, and I know you know that, but I think
I
it's
love
good to start there because it's very easy to be like, to reduce it to like this thing that's abstract and thus we can think about, but it doesn't really have to impact our decision making when it's really actually like a very, very like visceral element of what's
that. Yeah.
happening with respect to the relationships of the plants
Very
and the
current.
territories and so on. So we'll maybe that'll be our next podcast. But to your point, like so, it is true that many of the traditional peoples that work with many of these plants, plant teachers, have some sort of what one might see as like a gendered relationship with it. It's very common for ayahuasca to be described as a feminine spirit. It's very common for peyote to be described as a masculine spirit. It's very common for tobacco to be described as a masculine spirit or marijuana as a feminine spirit. So it's like there's sort of like these tropes, and like when you like have enough experience, you're like it kind of makes sense. You're like if you're engaging with it, there's a way where like that story like kind of coheres. Like it like, oh yeah, you're right. Like my experiences have felt more like that in this or that way. And I want to start by saying just big picture. It is true that in the globalization of these medicines, it's not just the medicine that globalizes, it's also the specific tradition that works with it, right? And in the Amazon, you're talking about a tradition that has dozens of different uh, kind of branches through different traditions that have emerged, sometimes like totally independently of one another in different parts of the Amazon, in different tribal contexts, and so on.
Yeah.
The reason I bring that up is because it's not true that like every single tribal context in the Amazon that works with ayahuasca sees it as like a feminine being.
Right.
Where my family is from in Colombia, the people of South Colombia, northern Ecuador, it's a very similar substance in the sense that it's made of the same things, but it's not usually called ayahuasca. They call it yahe, same concept. And many of the tribes that work with yahe use masculine pronouns to describe it. That's just one example where like the same substance, the same tool, experienced in very similar ways, ceremonial context, drank, like singing, trance experience, but the experience of it for this group of people who've been using it for like 800 or 1,000 or however many years, in this part of the Amazon, that's down the river from the other people from the other part of the Amazon, experience it differently in that sense. And I think that there's a lot of potential reasons for that. Like maybe it's the way that it was initially kind of introduced to the people, and this is like the momentum of that identity. Maybe it's that like the slight differences in the plants that are used or the region that's used actually like has a slightly different effect on the person, and then they experience it through this like lens of, is this more masculine, whatever that means, or is this more feminine, whatever that means? What I'm saying here is I think that there's truth, and also it's true in the sense that it's become true by it being held in this context by this traditional practice of these people for a long time, which has reified it, which has turned it into a truth. Because when people experience something, not just like them and the molecule, it's them and the molecule through the cultural mediation of the story around the thing.
Right.
And if that story is that this is a grandmother, then like it's a grandmother, you know?
Yeah.
So in that sense, I think that that's really true,
Hmm.
because I think that that cultural experience is, to me, it's like the answer to your question is it's true because of the priming. Like, I don't know if I would go so far as saying that I really believe that this particular plant spirit has a gender in like the human sense of the term. But I do believe that there are certain like clearly defined, like now multi-thousand-year-old in some cases threads of like the general vibe of the thing. There's a reason why like most of the world traditions that use mushrooms sort of treat them like mischievous little kids. Like that's not just a Central American thing. Like that is a thing. So I say that to say that like I think that there is an element of like the relationship of the molecules in the plants to us that we experience in sort of a collective consciousness sort of way, where like most people get some elements that are similar. And I think the priming of it is very important. And on a personal level, like I've experienced both as, and I think it's hard for me to tell because I experience life as a fairly gender fluid person. There's times where I'm much more masculine presenting. There's times where I'm much less. And I've experienced the medicines in the same way. It's not like it pairs with how I am necessarily, but I see the fluidity of these medicines in the sense that I'm like, I think that they're showing up in the way that that person is needing in that time, in that context. And again, I don't want to be careful to overshoot the woo meter, but like I do personally believe, just like out myself here, I do believe that there is like a what you might call a, like an independent wisdom, consciousness, knowledge element of these plants that are like interacting with us. Like I'm not a person that believes you take something and then your brain does everything. I'm like, ugh, I'm way past that point now. So I just like that's a way to say that like I think that it can be true, and I think it's a valuable thing to look at. And I think for people, especially when you think about attachment stuff, when you think about attachment, abandonment, it's like sometimes it's really important to be experiencing, for some people, to experience the medicine as a particular sexual or gender
Mhm.
identity. Sometimes that's part of the healing. And like, who am I to say that that's not real?
Yeah,
Doesn't matter. It's real to them.
right. I love that last piece, and that's so much of how I move through this world is like, it doesn't matter if it works for you. If it's impactful for you in a beautiful way, like, who cares?
All about it. All about it. The placebo effect
Yeah,
is one of the most marvelous
absolutely,
things
absolutely.
because it doesn't
Yeah,
matter.
yeah.
I mean, it does in some version of reality. Like, it's not that it doesn't at all. It like in the particular framework of like a Western rationalist materialist
Yeah,
framework, which is a legitimate one, it does matter.
right.
And also, it's like that's just one of like a whole cascade of cosmologies that we're always interacting with all the time. Like, come on.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, I really love the way that you answered that question with your own personal experience of them and also sort of the fluidity of it and of the contextualization of where and who it's coming from, being used by, etcetera, and something that I've thought a lot about this partially because I was deep in yogic and tantric studies before I ever experimented with plant medicine, and so my understanding of masculine and feminine qualities on an energetic level, separating that from men and women, but purely on the energetics of what is Shiva and what is Shakti? What is masculine? What is
Sure. Yeah.
feminine? The
Yeah.
the sort of pillar of unchanging strength and directiveness and the riverbank that the river flows within and the structure for all of it to move inside of the consciousness that holds the energy being the masculine and then the energy itself,
Hmm.
life itself, the everythingness, the chaos, the beauty, the receptiveness of feminine qualities. And
Sure.
so
Yeah.
within that structure, it's been really fascinating to look at these different plants and see, well, how do
Mm.
they A, make me feel and B, exist as their own being in a way within my own system? And
Hmm.
so I remember once being in an ayahuasca ceremony and it was absolute chaos and pleasure and pain and everything under the sun. And I was working with some people who also utilize tobacco within their
Hmm.
ceremonial structure. And my body was kind of like all over the place. I was like definitely having a moment. And
Lots
I
going
had
on.
yeah. And then I had a little bit of mapacho, of this ceremonial
Mhm.
tobacco. And as I inhaled or as I brought it into my mouth, I felt my shoulders expand and widen. I felt my jaw go down and out, and I felt my spine straighten up, and I felt
Mm.
like the somatic sensation was I felt like a grandfather wolf sitting on my porch smoking a
Cool.
cigar was the feeling, and I felt so grounded and like I felt this access point to this inner pole so instantaneously. It was like it felt like the smoke came into my mouth and then kind of washed over my body and
Hmm.
really completely transformed my experience. And in that moment, I was like, "Oh, that's what they're talking about." Got it.
Definitely, definitely. And I'll say that I will say that even though I just said what I just said, tobacco is one of those things that actually is mostly masculine everywhere you
Ah,
go.
yeah.
So that's super real.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, absolutely. Another friend of mine was talking about the feeling of someone was asking him, well, what is the feeling of ayahuasca versus peyote, which is like you can't
Mm.
really explain that, but you can definitely try, and that's a fun
Yeah.
conversation to have. And actually, in my very first ayahuasca ceremony, I remember feeling like I was being held in a woman's lap, and I was kind of afraid. And I heard this voice, this sort of internal, all around me voice, just be like, "Trust me, I got you." And
Hmm.
I kind of felt like I was lying in a woman's lap and being moved around and
Yeah.
turned and cleaned up and everything. And this friend, he described it very similarly, of being
Hmm.
in the arms of a woman who is sort of working you and moving you and taking you on a
Hmm.
ride.
Oh, definitely. Yeah.
Whereas his experience of peyote felt like your dad or your grandfather coming up next to you and sort of leaning towards your ear and saying, "What do you want to do with this time? Like,
Hmm.
I've got you. I'm here with you. I'll support you. I'll guide you, but you've got to be ready. You've got to let me know where you want to go and um, engage with me in that way." And when he
Hmm.
expressed it that way, so many of us, we were talking in a group of people, and so many of us felt such a resonance with what he was saying, of like, that is what it
Yeah.
feels like. That is what the one of the differences between the energetics of those two plants, that feels very much like mother or grandmother and father or grandfather. And
Yeah. There's a reason that they landed. I would say
yeah,
like most of the time that feels pretty. It feels pretty on point. And ayahuasca is a very interesting example actually because it's actually two plants
right.
that actually do both. And this has been the most the when I learned this and like when this like landed in my mind, it was actually really helpful because ayahuasca is a really good example of something that has both the container, the containing, and then the light. So it's kind of like what you were just describing of like, these concepts that like we kind of distill into the words
Right.
masculinity and femininity or vice versa, like are actually more about like the foundational rules of how the universe operates that we're just kind of like in some ways like with our puny human brains like trying to rationalize within our own experience of reality. But I like the way that you put that. And I think it's true that like and I've spent a lot of time. I should maybe this is maybe a good time to just mention this. I've spent a lot of time with queer theory and like queering, like what does it mean to look outside of the binary, and have spent a lot of time outside of it myself in my own like life and experience. And one of the reasons I think it's still worth really having this conversation, even though I do really like, I'm really into this, like, what does this post-binary thing look like?
Mm.
Like, I'm like, whoa, like this is part of the evolution of our understanding of consciousness, I think. But I think part of the reason it's important to stay in the conversation about polarity is because in fact like even if you are outside of the binary, like I think that everything is a spectrum, everything all the time.
Yeah.
So there's a certain level where like even if you're like haha I am outside of the binary, like even that existence or the distance from that is a spectrum if you break it down. So there's a certain level where to me queering these concepts looks a lot, and I'm sure you'll have other speakers maybe that or other podcast guests that will speak about this a lot more eloquently than I can, but there's a certain level where I can really see how the queering conversation is also just acknowledgement that we're talking polarities that have a spectrum in
Right.
between or that have these other kind of like axes that are kind of like part of it. So I just think it's like it's fun, but it's also interesting and informative, as you were saying earlier, to like look at like, well, what are these like one version of these foundational building blocks for how things operate. And it's all polar and it's all on a spectrum all at the same time. That's what quantum theory is all about. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And like you said before, in a sense, like it doesn't matter. The genderization of it, the stories we tell ourselves, the relationship we have to it. What does
Yeah.
matter is, do we respect them? Do we respect where
Hmm.
they're coming from? Do we know who meaning which plants to call upon for what our own
Hmm.
personal, do we have a relationship of respect, care, and integrity with the plants themselves? And to me, that is so much more important. And then anything beyond that is fun. It's interesting. It's curious.
Details.
It's
Yeah.
delightful. It's healing. It's whatever it needs to be for us.
Can I go one step deeper into this?
Please.
Because one of the things that's coming up as you're talking is also this idea of the earth as a mother.
Mm.
And there's again, you should probably have a whole other podcast about like ecosexuality and earth as mother, earth as partner. There's a lot there, a lot there. But the reason I bring it up is because, and it sort of comes up when we're talking here, because, to your point, like, I agree, like what matters, or without like projecting my own perspective on it, like it really matters how we relate to the world around us. Like,
Yeah.
whether you believe it in because of karma, whether it's because of climate change, whatever the thing is, like I personally am, I believe that like it matters. It also doesn't, because nothing does, but it does in the sense that even from like a purely like psychological character perspective, it's not an accident that people associate how you care about nature or your like the things that you care about your relationships with like the reflection of yourself, right? And there's a sort of kind of trope maybe that, like the way you treat others is how you really feel about yourself. There's sort of that kind of thing, and maybe there's truth in that, I don't know. But the reason I bring this up is because, going back to the plant piece and kind of the relationship to these like non-ordinary states of consciousness, or these like transpersonal, like non-individuated understandings, is that like whether or not you're seeing the earth as a mother or as a lover, but in either way, like I've been curious about how the desire to gender the earth and like life is related to like what you're describing, which is that like actually our job is just to like respect it and honor
Yeah.
it, like in the right way. And if that's what it takes, great. Like if it takes like in this anthropomorphizing lens to treat the earth better, great. If it's because like that we know that we're all part of one conscious living entity, great. To me, it doesn't like it's kind of what I was saying, like it doesn't really matter the path that you get
Yeah.
there. It's like the thing is that it's what your relationship to it. It's the same with the plant medicines, the same with identity. Like I think that if where you're at, if you're what you're moving toward is sovereignty and agency and responsibility and integrity, then like let it be tantra, let it be the plants, let it be like journaling. I don't care what tactic you take to
Yeah.
get there.
Yeah.
Um, anyway,
Yeah, I so agree. I so agree. It's like whatever supports you in remembering what's important.
yeah, as long as it doesn't hurt other people, and like thankfully, most things don't.
Right.
Actually,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So you answered this a little bit at the beginning, but I'd love to touch back in on it. You've
Hmm.
dedicated your life, right, to psychedelic policy
Mm,
reform. And so why is it that you are choosing to dedicate yourself to this
mm,
specifically, and also within the realm of psychedelics and plant medicines? There's so much that you can do within that realm. Why take it to policy reform? Why take it
hmm.
to sort of the legalities behind it? Why is that the area that you choose to put yourself, and why do you feel like that is your specific mission and purpose within this movement?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I also appreciate that you're asking with, like 15 or 20 or so minutes left, because if you asked me this at the beginning, we'd still be talking about it. So this forces me to be succinct, which is a good edge for me. Um, okay, so the core reason, and not to be corny, but if I could just distill it into one sentence, it's because I believe in protecting healers.
Mm,
Well, let me put it actually, I believe that healers should be protected, is actually a better way to put it. And what that means to me is that we suffer, and like I believe that maybe part of consciousness is suffering in like the kind of very foundational kind of Buddhist sense, where it's like that we have consciousness means that like we have to deal with choice, and we have to deal with like these things that cause suffering. But I don't. So in some ways, I am among the people that believe that some element of suffering is part of the human condition. I However, I would differentiate suffering from oppression. I don't think oppression is inherent to the human
mm,
condition. I think oppression is something that humans do to each other. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be or not be. We can go down that rabbit hole. But either way, like what I know and what I believe is that people oppress each other. And that's something that can be, I think that that's something that can be stopped, or that can be redirected or changed. I'm not here trying to like eliminate the suffering of the world, because I think that that's a futile thing. Sure, you can make things easier and more comfortable, but like there's to me, I'm like it's part of the deal. Whereas with oppression, I'm like, oh, actually, like I think that we invented that ourselves, and I think that we can work on that. So that's kind of the foundational step. And then the next is where I started, which is like I think that it's really important for people who are healers, which to me here is a kind of a catch-all for people who are working to end the oppression of other people. And when people hear the word oppression, they usually think like person to person in like a geopolitical sense, like, oh, there's a group of people that are oppressing another group of people. And that is a thing. And that is a thing that can be healed from like a social structural perspective, which is kind of where like the law culture stuff comes in. And I'll come back to that. But a key element of when people think healing, most of it is they're thinking about people supporting each other in like group or interpersonal or one-on-one context. And even though we think of oppression as structural, I think that a lot of like oppression shows up in these micro relationships interpersonally and also internally. So this idea, like the reason I've gotten so like fixated on the law and policy stuff is both because I have the energy for it and I have the brain for it. I'm like, I'm not going to feel like this my whole life, young and spry. I don't mind being on a computer for 10 hours a day. Sometimes I do. But it's like I like have the energy to do that. So it feels like a way that I can contribute to this goal of a post-prohibition, a more compassionate, more just world where people have more tools to respond to and heal from oppression, whether it's them doing it to themselves, whether it's because of their circumstances, whether it's because of society, whatever that is. So that's like the core thing. And how to support healers in their own protection and their own support, I think is a big question. There's like how to heal. And you and I both know that there's so many amazing modalities of like offering support, whether or not medicine is involved. And the people who are offering that service, even if they're getting paid, people are offering that service to like be in relationship to the gnarly interpersonal inner workings of our minds. Like it's not fun. It takes a lot of sacrifice to be in that position, even though it's like kind of hot right now. Everyone wants to be a healer, but like then they realize how hard it is to be a healer. And you're like, oh, actually, I just want to have a marketing job. Like, and no disrespect to that at all. Like, it's fine. It's totally fine. But I think that there's sort of this moment where it's like, we need the help. So like everyone's got to show up. And I'm like, I believe that. I'm like, oh yeah, we need the help. We need as many healers. Like everyone's got to get online right now. So that's a long way to say that like I have felt from the beginning of my career that like one of the ways that I can support that is by finding those people who are trying to do it in these different ways and like kind of creating some room. And the law piece is really just a recognition of like the history of the war on drugs and drug control, which, I have a whole spiel about this, but it's like it didn't start 50 years ago with the war on drugs. It started 500 years ago when these like very large institutions like the Catholic Church, European imperialist entities, and people seeking, colonize. They're like beginning of the kind of the modern era of colonization. It was like we see people in their traditional cultural context in relationship to plants. That's bad because it threatens the hierarchy of the state. It threatens like the fact that we need a mediator between us and the divine. It threatens XYZ. So like that's the oppression, that's the baggage or kind of the momentum of oppression that we're dealing with. So I'm like, okay, well, I can learn the law and learn the language of the oppressor and learn the language of the system as it exists in order to like figure out where some threads can be pulled. But I don't know if I'll be here forever. Like I think that this is where I feel very strongly about right now, and I have a super like my brain loves the nerdy technical stuff of like how do you design the infrastructure for what reality, how people will behave. But the law is just a tool. The real thing is culture.
Mm.
Culture is where it's like really, really held. Like the law can say whatever it wants. And that's what I mean. I'm like, I'm there for now because we need to change that because it's so far behind and so far off that like let's at least get a little bit closer to what feels like it makes sense.
Right.
But that's really just to get it so people aren't being like actively persecuted for trying to heal.
Right.
Just there, that's like getting us from -10 to like -1,
Right.
like maybe to zero.
Right.
We're like,
Where you've got like
then
ayahuasca and methamphetamine like on the same schedule. It's pretty wild.
totally. Actually, DMT's in Schedule 1, methamphetamines in Schedule 2. So just to, just to, and there's a lot to say about that. Methamphetamine has really powerful uses, including medical
Yeah.
ones. But yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. It's like, ooh, the logic was probably off here somewhere.
Right. Something was probably distorted in some way somewhere.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So anyway, thanks for listening to that spiel. But yeah, like I feel like we need all hands on deck,
Yeah.
and I'm just out here trying to like make it a little bit safer for people to bring their hands onto the deck. If
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah, beautiful.
extending the metaphor.
It's so needed, and I wanna personally say thank you for, like, nerding out on those details for those of us who are like, I don't nerd out on that. That is not my highest joy. So, yeah. Yeah, and, I think to speak to what you were just mentioning around the structures that are threatened by anything that allows us to be in direct personal power and direct communication with the divine, with something greater than ourselves. A lot of systems have been very carefully structured around, well, you can't access these ecstatic states of
Right.
being or this deep knowing of truth without a white guy in a robe.
Without the thing, whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Whatever, insert whatever is
Yeah.
is there. And I see that psychedelics and sexuality are two of the hugest areas where we have an access point to something beyond our everyday reality, where we have an access point to a deep knowing of our own personal truth, our own personal divinity, our own personal power.
Hmm.
And they are two areas that have been so incredibly demonized and tabooized. And I
Yeah.
see them as
Misunderstood and yeah.
yeah, and they're also 2 areas where I see there's potential for deep, deep, deep distortion, both within sexuality and
Also true.
within psychedelics
Definitely.
and drug usage and
Definitely.
medicines and all of it. But what I heard you saying and what I find so beautiful is that you're here in order to support the healers who are using that tool specifically, meaning plant medicines,
Hmm.
as a force of bringing people back to themselves, and you're sort of
Hmm.
playing the part of, okay, here's the structure that has made it really hard to legally
Hmm.
connect to yourself in that specific way, and
Hmm.
here's how we can actually rework that structure so that we can utilize this tool as a way to reconnect to ourselves. And as society is changing and as the structures are changing and we're more and more people are starting to wake up to, wait a second, I've been so cut off from myself, from my divinity, from my sexuality, from my heart, from my whatever, and
Hmm.
now I'm seeing these areas where I can reconnect, and plant medicines, psychedelics are not needed for that, but are one potential route, just like sexuality is one potential route for a deep personal empowerment. And the difference there being that sexuality is inherently within you, whereas plant medicines are
Hmm.
not
Yeah.
inherently within
Yes,
you.
exactly.
But those being these access points that we tend to have so much resistance to, shame around, beliefs about, literal laws preventing us from accessing,
Hmm.
that are such potent, such beautiful access points to our own power and to our own wholeness.
Yeah, and maybe just to like connect this to what we were talking about earlier, like many of the laws or structure that are meant to mediate that are done in the name of safety. And I think that there's again, like again, maybe this is I think we have trailheads for like 3 or 4 podcasts now, but this is like I think that it to me at least what you're saying comes back to this concept of safety and the perception of what that
Yeah,
is and what that means. And there's a lot of conversation happening out there right now around like the difference between safety and comfort and how people conflate that. And like there's more to say about that than we can say here. But I bring that up to say that like I think that this may be a bold statement, but like kind of what's coming up for me is that safety or the experience of safety is something that a person can cultivate. And there is a certain level of like environmental elements that impact that for sure. And whether or not someone feels safe is not only about their external environment. And you see lots of examples where you have misalignment, whether it's like trauma disorders or other things where people's experience of safety and whether or not they're actually safe is misaligned. And you see this on the internet a lot with like the culture of like, I'm not feeling safe because I've been made to feel uncomfortable. And like, there's a lot
right.
to say about that. But I bring it up because I think, just as we start to land this conversation, like it's really scary to confront the construction of your own identity and whatever tools you use to get that, whether it's sexuality, whether it's plant medicine, whether it's something totally different. So much of that is, I think, exactly as you said, like about it's sort of this kind of self-fulfilling paradox where it's kind of coming back to yourself, which reminds you who you are, so you can remember who you are, so you can come back to yourself. It's like this kind of like you actually like can generate your own power and fortitude and resilience in that over time. I was reflecting recently on like what does it mean to have fortitude? Like what does it mean? Like because you've used the word power a few times. I've been like, what does, not to you specifically, but I thought about it, like, what does power mean? Well, I can experience it like in like governance or in corporate dynamics, or like where there's like someone who can make a decision and someone who can't. You see in politics, like you see in geopolitical environments, like who's got the bigger guns.
Hmm.
But like it's this whole conversation has me reflecting on like how we navigate power, and I think that how we navigate not just power dynamics, which is its own whole thing that I know you also talk a lot about, but also like how do we navigate the cultivation and understanding of our own
Right.
power. And that is where I do think that there's an intersection between like the identity piece and how we show up in the world, because how someone is gendered, or how their life, how their experience is sexualized or gendered, does affect, I think, how they experience both the receiving of and then the wielding of power.
Right.
And again, this is something I think that you've talked about a lot, and it, like in your work, and I think probably other people that you've spoken to either here or in other places, like because I think that there's a certain level where the psychedelics, the sexuality, these tools, they're tools, they're pathways to something that's there, and I think a lot of people mistake them as being the end in
Right.
themselves. And I think that like I see this with drugs a lot and with medicine a lot, and I say this as someone who really loves drugs and who really respects and loves medicine and like I really really am like so committed to what I think emerges from that. And also I'm like, oh, I can see how you can be really distracted by like the shiny stuff
Yeah.
or the sexy stuff or like that,
Absolutely.
because we're humans, like we're kind of simple.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. I so resonate with that. And within psychedelics and plant medicines, I see so many people seeing them as the end point of like, "Oh, I found the thing," as opposed to, "How can
Hmm.
this point me back to myself? How can this point me back to my own happiness, my own connection to the earth, my own way of living? How can it teach me and show me and give me pointers and teachings without depending on or relying on that thing, but rather to integrate. It's like that saying, when you get the message, put down, hang up the phone. It's
Yeah.
it's which isn't to say stop psychedelic usage once you've gotten a really beautiful message, but
Totally, totally.
necessarily, or maybe do, maybe that
Yeah.
is your
Necessarily, maybe for some people, for
yeah,
sure.
yeah, but it's really this to utilize them again with respect, with reverence also for your own path, and how you can utilize any of these things as a pathway back to your own inner power. And when I say power, I really truly mean my power to know myself, my power to set my
Hmm.
boundaries, my power to feel
Hmm.
connected to myself, to do what it is that feels truest for me in this world, and to utilize it as a pathway back to that. And it's the same with sexuality. I know for myself, when I started deepening into my studies of sexuality, it in a way became less and less about sex and more about my own connection to myself as a woman, as a
For
human.
sure.
And it's really
For sure.
it's that again with sexuality, it's a bit different because it's in many ways, in my perception of sexuality, that's something that is inherently an energy within us that we're constantly working with. And so there is
Yeah.
a quality of, okay, I will always be working with this, I will always be working with human
Yeah.
sexuality. But it ripples out so much further than just sex, that I sometimes say I like to desexualize sex in a way. It's like, how
That's a
do
good
I
one.
connect
I like that.
to my sexuality, not to be sexier to have better sex, but rather to feel my connection to myself, to the earth, to my life, to my power, my inner power, a direct connection without the distortions of whatever else that sexuality has been passing through.
Right. Right. I mean, I feel like this feels like a good like closing note too, right? Because I think that that phrase navigating distortions feels very important here. Um, and again, that could be its own whole conversation, but it is, like I said, like, and as you acknowledged also, it is easy. And I don't really like blame people for getting caught up in the phenomenology of the drug experience or sex or other things. Because it's like pleasure is real, and it's got like a function, and part of it is to keep us occupied, and it works.
Hmm.
So there's a certain level where like I don't cast moral judgment on humans for being human beings with our sensory experience.
Yeah.
Like that's part of the deal too. It's like suffering and then you feel things. Well, they're kind of interlinked. um, but I do feel like just since we started this conversation, and and because we're talking about medicines in these different states, like it does feel like it's important to acknowledge like how easy it is for those things to be distorted by that like constant like
Mm,
just push of conditioning that we're
yeah.
navigating, whether it's from like the media or our families or the history of traditional culture, whatever it is, like the various directions that it comes from. And I just like I always caution people. I think I stopped being like an advocate for psychedelic use a long time ago. There was a point when I was, especially when I was a teenager, I was like, everybody should do this. And then like, I'm really glad that I'm over that because it's definitely not true. Um, but I said it to say that like, I do feel like it's good to both hold this like visionary expansive potential that actually really is more than you can imagine, like it really is that it's more than we are able to imagine, because when we're in our imagination based on our conditioning, that's like limited by the identity we carry and the baggage of that. And it's also very easy, like the further out it goes, the easier it is for that to be distorted by those
Mhm.
other things. And I think it is really important, and I imagine it's the same with sexuality, but for sure with substances and psychedelics, there's a reason why you go like bits and bits and bits at a time, and you give it this time the space to do it. I don't know if you can do this, but you should definitely put up that fucking integrate me, bro. Like I'm sure you can just bring that meme in like all the time, but it's just like it's that thing where it's like, and there's a whole thing to unpack around like integration versus disintegration, and like
Mhm.
plugging in versus, there's a lot there also. But just for the sake of like this conversation, I do think that warning people of the risk of distortion and encouraging people to constantly be in a process of self-reflection around that is really valuable, no matter who you are, no matter what drugs you're doing, no matter who you're having sex with.
Yeah.
Like, so I do feel like that's a very key thing, which is like, yes, all those things are true, and also we're all being tricked all the time. So just like pay attention.
Yeah, I feel like I have this conversation could go on for so many more hours. We'll definitely have to do another episode because there's so much here, and I'm so appreciating the way that you think about all of it and the intention and care and holistic quality that you perceive all of this with. So thank you so much, so much for doing the work that you do and for doing it with such integrity and for being so damn cool while you're doing it. And I'm curious if people want to know more about your work and what you're doing, how can they find you? How can they understand more about what you're doing?
Yeah, thanks. First off, just thank you for this conversation. I'm thrilled to be in it, and I hope we get a lot more. I'm like, I'm like, yeah, my engine's revved. Like, let's get into this. This is totally just a warm up. But yeah, I'm just grateful for you and your presence, and I'm really grateful for the invitation coming on. And I hope we have, like I said, like lots more opportunities. Where can people find me? I'm like sometimes on the internet, Sage_Izzy on Instagram. I'm technically not on Twitter anymore, but I'm secretly sometimes on it. It's been really good for my mental health to be off of it this year, for a lot of reasons. But definitely like Instagram is an option. The organization I work for, Maps, is available on, as I think it's maps_org or maps__org. Easy to find on the internet. Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. You can find the Psychedelic Bar Association if you're a legal professional at thepsychedelicbar.org. We acculturate and train attorneys interested in working in this space, both from like a cultural integration piece and also like substantive legal training. And besides that, I go to things. Sometimes I'm out of my house, and hopefully we get to cross paths somewhere outside. But also, and I'm very sheepish saying this, but you can Google my name, and there are lots of videos, especially on YouTube, of like a variety of talks that can provide like lots more into like the policy technical stuff. Like I said, I'm really glad we got a chance to be in this expansive conversation today. But if that is what anyone's interested in,
Yeah.
there's a lot of that on the internet also.
Amazing. Beautiful. Well, it's so good to see you. I'm excited for whenever we get to sit down and have tea in person and get some more time together. So appreciate you, what you're doing and how you're doing it.
Yeah, same to you. Thank you again. And yeah, just sending a lot of love to all of the listeners and people who are in this ongoing conversation. Sometimes I really sound like I know what I'm talking about, and sometimes I do. But I think I am also as on my path of learning as we all are. So I'm just really grateful to be in conversation because it helps me also better understand myself. And I wish that for you and everybody else,
Beautiful.
in this little universe.
Beautiful. Thank you, Izzy.